He'd driven that road 100 times, a familiar stretch of asphalt cutting through empty fields and dense, quiet woods. Tonight was supposed to be like any other, just him, his car, and miles of open road. The headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating nothing but emptiness ahead. No other cars, no lights, just silence pressing in from every side. Minutes passed, and a strange calm filled the air. It was a silence that swallowed everything, the hum of the engine, the faint rustling of the wind outside, until it felt like he was the only person left in the world. But as he drove on, a chill crept up his spine, the growing sense that he wasn't truly alone. He brushed it off as nerves. Maybe fatigue from a long day, and kept driving. But the feeling lingered, heavy and unshakable. Adjusting his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of the empty road behind him. At least, he thought it was empty. Something shifted in the shadows, just barely there, as though something was hiding in the darkness. He told himself it was nothing, that his mind was playing tricks. Yet, each time he looked back, he could swear he saw a shape, a shadow, slipping in and out of view, staying just on the edge of sight. It was close, closer than he wanted to believe. And as the road stretched on, the terrifying thought took hold: whatever was watching him had been there all along, just waiting for him to finally notice. There's something about driving alone at night that makes the world feel different. The familiar road takes on a darker edge, the silence becomes heavier. Headlights cut through the shadows, but only just enough to remind you of how much darkness surrounds you. And in those moments, when it's just you, the car, and miles of empty road stretching on and on, you realize how isolated you really are. In the quiet, your mind starts to play tricks. Was that a figure on the side of the road? A shadow moving just out of sight? And with no one else around, no way to explain away the strange feeling crawling up your spine, it's easy to feel vulnerable. Exposed. Like maybe, you're not as alone as you thought. Some people who drive those empty roads have stories they can't explain, stories that follow them even after they reach home. This is one of those stories. It started like any other night, but ended with a passenger who may have never left. He spotted the man just standing there on the side of the road, thumb raised, not moving. The headlights barely illuminated him, but he could make out enough. A tall, quiet figure, eyes down, waiting for someone to stop. Against his better judgment, he pulled over, rolling down the window to ask if the man needed a lift. The man said nothing, just climbed into the back seat and stared out the window, silent. He tried to strike up a conversation, asking where he was headed, but got no response. The only answer was the man's reflection in the rearview mirror, pale skin, ashen, like he hadn't seen daylight in years, and eyes that didn't quite seem to focus. As they drove, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the faintest sound of breathing, and each minute that passed, his discomfort grew. Something wasn't right. The air felt colder, thick with a tension he couldn't shake. He gripped the wheel tighter, glancing occasionally in the mirror. Was he imagining it, or did the man's face look different each time he looked back? Almost distorted, he could have sworn he heard whispers, faint and barely there, just under his own breath. Like someone muttering a secret he wasn't meant to hear. It sent a chill through him, and he wanted nothing more than to pull over, to end this strange, silent drive. But before he could, they reached a stop sign. Finally, he turned around, ready to say something, to confront this eerie passenger who had been so quiet the whole time. But when he looked back, the back seat was empty. The man was gone, as if he had never been there at all. And yet the door was still locked. Heart racing, he took off down the road, putting as much distance as he could between himself and that spot. But as he looked in the rearview mirror one last time, his blood went cold. Muddy footprints led across the back seat, fading out, as if they'd been left by something that wasn't quite real, and then, he heard it, a whisper, so faint he almost missed it, drifting from the back seat, "Thank you. For the ride." It was late, and she was just trying to get home. The road stretched on, empty and silent, with only the faint hum of her engine and the occasional flash of headlights as she passed mile markers. She didn't expect to see anyone out there at that hour, especially not on that stretch of lonely highway, but as she passed the next mile marker, she saw him, a figure standing near the edge of the road, barely illuminated by her headlights. She thought it must be a hitchhiker, someone lost, maybe waiting for help. She kept driving, assuming he'd disappear in the darkness behind her. A few minutes later, her heart sank. Just up ahead, there he was again, standing in the exact same way, staring out at the road. It didn't make sense. She hadn't passed any cars, hadn't seen anyone walking. And yet, there he was, closer this time, just a few feet from her path. She gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles going white. She tried to brush it off as her mind playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. She pushed down on the gas, hoping to put distance between her and whatever she'd just seen. The road stretched on, the darkness seemed thicker, pressing in closer with each passing second. She tried to distract herself, turning on the radio, but instead of music, she heard faint sounds that almost sounded like whispers. Overlapping with the static, filling the car with an unsettling noise. She told herself she was imagining things, that she just needed to focus on getting home. But then, just as she was starting to calm down, she saw him again. This time, he was standing right beside the road, almost close enough to reach out and touch her car as she passed. She forced herself not to look, not to slow down, trying to pretend he wasn't there. But every nerve in her body was telling her something was horribly wrong. Her foot pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding down the road. She couldn't help herself. She glanced in the rearview mirror. Her breath caught. There he was, standing in the middle of the road, impossibly still, watching her as she drove away. She couldn't understand how he kept appearing, how he was moving faster than she could drive. She felt her pulse racing, a cold sweat forming as she struggled to keep her eyes on the road ahead. Finally, she pulled into her driveway, heart pounding, hands shaking. She scrambled out of the car, fumbling for her keys, desperate to get inside. She didn't look back, didn't want to know if he'd somehow followed her all the way home. But when she finally took a breath and turned to close her door, she froze. On the back bumper, 2 handprints were pressed into the dust, clear as day, as though someone had been holding on all the way home. He thought he'd take a shortcut. Just a back road, a quicker route to get home, one he'd never tried before. At first, it seemed easy enough, a quiet road, winding through fields and clusters of trees, the kind of road that felt like it had been forgotten. But after a few minutes, he noticed something strange. Up ahead, there was a tree he could swear he'd passed already, a peculiar one, with a thick trunk twisted at an odd angle, reaching out like gnarled fingers. He shook it off, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks. But a few minutes later, he saw the same tree again, and just beyond it, an old abandoned house, dark and empty, with broken windows that seemed to stare back at him. His grip tightened on the wheel as he tried to focus. He took a left turn, thinking he'd get back on track. But there it was, that same twisted tree, that same empty house. His frustration grew, a tight knot forming in his chest. He tried taking a different turn, then another, and then yet another, each time hoping it would break the cycle. But no matter what he did, no matter how many turns he took, the same stretch of road kept reappearing, like he was caught in some unending loop. Then, as he drove, his radio crackled to life. A faint, distorted voice seeped through the static. At first, he couldn't make out the words, just a low, garbled sound, almost like a whisper. But as he strained to listen, he swore he heard his own name, faint and stretched, drifting through the static. It sent a chill down his spine. He reached over, turning the radio off, but even then, the uneasy feeling lingered. In desperation, he pulled the car to a stop, thinking that maybe, just maybe, he could reset the route if he paused for a moment. He sat there in silence, the engine humming softly, the headlights casting long beams into the darkness ahead. And then he heard it, faint footsteps, crunching against the gravel behind him, slowly approaching, each step steady, measured, growing closer. His heart pounded as he glanced over his shoulder, peering into the darkness. But there was nothing there. The footsteps stopped, leaving only silence. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the stillness around him. Finally, he made a decision. He couldn't keep going in circles, not like this. He had to get out, to see if he could find his way on foot. He stepped out of the car, the night air cold against his skin, the silence heavier than ever. But as he took a step forward, his stomach dropped. There, in front of him, was his car, still running, headlights blazing, engine humming softly. It was as if he'd never left the driver's seat. And then he looked closer, his eyes catching the reflection in the side mirror. In the dim light, he saw his own face. Only, it wasn't quite right. There, staring back at him, his own face wore a smile, a twisted, unsettling grin, one he knew he wasn't making. And as he took a step back, his reflection didn't move. He'd been driving for hours, the highway stretching out endlessly in front of him. It was quiet, the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were the last person on earth. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen, an unknown number. Normally, he would have ignored it, but something made him pick up. Maybe it was the emptiness of the road or the stillness pressing in around him, he answered, and at first, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, a voice spoke, calm, almost familiar, but distorted, as if coming through a broken speaker. The voice said his name, drawing it out slowly, like a question. He felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know this voice. Yet it sounded like someone he should recognize. Who is this? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. There was a pause, then the voice began listing off details, small, specific things about him, things no stranger should know. The color of his car, the turns he'd taken, the exact time he'd left home. He felt his grip tighten on the wheel, his pulse quickening. "I'm watching you," the voice said, low and calm, as if it were just a simple fact. He glanced out the window, half expecting to see someone standing on the side of the road, watching as he passed. But there was nothing. Only the empty stretch of highway disappearing into darkness. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was some kind of prank. But the voice became more insistent, describing the things he could see as he drove: a flickering streetlight, the faint outline of a tree on the horizon. The voice whispered every detail, following his every move. And as he kept driving, he realized that whoever was on the other end of the line wasn't behind him. They were right there, seeing everything he saw. His hand shook as he hung up, heart pounding. He pulled off to the side of the road, trying to calm himself, to make sense of what had just happened. He took a few deep breaths, telling himself it was over, that the call had just been a trick of the mind. But then his phone buzzed again. The same unknown number, he answered. His voice barely a whisper, "What do you want?" This time, the voice was different, familiar, but disturbingly so. It was his own voice, speaking back to him, just above a whisper, saying, "Don't look in the back seat." His blood ran cold. Slowly, almost against his will, he glanced into the rearview mirror. There, staring back at him, was his own face. Only, it wasn't quite right. His reflection wore a twisted, unnatural smile, eyes dark and hollow. And as he stared, frozen in terror, his own face winked. Some roads are just different. They hold a quiet that feels heavier, a darkness that seems deeper. And those who find themselves driving along them well, sometimes, they don't return the same. They thought they were just driving home, that they'd be safe once they left those places behind. But some places are best left undisturbed. Because once you look back, sometimes something looks back at you. So, have you ever felt that cold chill on a night drive? Ever had that unsettling feeling that you weren't truly alone on the road? Share your own stories in the comments, if you dare. And if you're drawn to tales like these, make sure to subscribe. This was just a glimpse into the eerie places you might encounter. There are more stories waiting. Stories that might just follow you home.